All right, thanks very much, everyone. My name is Shane Bergeron. I'm from Pfizer, as well as I'm the coordinator for scientific coordinator for Research. And welcome back to the second day. We have a session on bioinformatics tools. I'm really hoping some of the other people who are speaking will actually talk about those things. I guess one item that was requested just to remind people and encourage people, if you're intending to take a training, please sign up for them. And the training lists are in the lobby. All right. I think to start this off, my talk is supposed to be titled "How Infrastructure Projects Help to Coordinate the Field." And honestly, I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't know I had a talk until I actually checked the agenda. So it was kind of interesting. So I'm going to try to figure out a way of approaching opening the session in a way that hopefully maybe a little distinct, but hopefully it'll make some sense. So first of all, I'd like to start off with a set of work that I did probably a few years ago that was just kind of interested in exploring what types of elements drive open source projects. And in the end, get to the punchline, in the end, what I found kind of does that, or what appears to do that, is many of the most pertinent and famous open source projects tend to have incumbent commercial products already existing and already in use. And basically the business processes is already set such that an open source application can come in and essentially serve an underserved customer group and then grow from there. And in that way, they're essentially an indirect, kind of almost a classic indirect attack on an established market. When it came to Transmart, it was one of the interesting things with Transmart as an open source product. It was pretty clear that wasn't the case for Transmart. Transmart didn't have an existing established product that it could mimic the processes. And because of that, I always felt that we needed to approach Transmart a little differently than, say, Apache or Linux. And where a lot of the economic advantage associated with open source tends to start was from the seminal article by Yochai Benkler at Harvard University. And his thought was, at the time in 2002, economists were really trying to understand how something like open source could work, especially from the context of free riders, and basically free riders that could pull value from an open source community, and how an open source community could survive. And he had thought that modularity had something to play with it, that if you could make modules small enough and workable enough, that you could essentially drive, from an economic standpoint, the value inherent within an open source product. What was very interesting in the article, and something that always stuck with me, is that he basically presumed or posited that in order to make an open source community work, that like a commercial community, there has to be consumer surplus associated with the community and with the product. And not only does it have to be greater than zero, it has to be large enough that it's the consumer surplus that can support a diversity of players within the community, especially players that are going to be free riders. And without that, the open source product would probably fail. To talk a little bit about high school economics, a little bit about what consumer surplus is. It's basically that amount of money that a consumer is willing to pay versus the market price. So it's the value that they kind of inherently feel that they're getting from something that they purchase, whether it's a product or a service. Conversely, the producer surplus is that amount of value that the market price minus the cost that it takes a consumer to produce something. And obviously, if you're a standard commercial consumer, you're trying to maximize that as best as you can. And all those things are really simple concepts. The reality is they give rise to very intricate and very sophisticated marketing techniques. For example, like discretionary pricing, that essentially tries to maximize the consumer surplus relative maximize the producer surplus relative to someone's willingness to pay. But in an open source environment, what's positive is that you really have to focus on the consumer surplus side and make sure that there's enough value there that can actually drive the community forward. Now, of course, like many economic models, they exist as an equilibrium. And that equilibrium, ultimately drive down to something that is what looks like a zero-sum game. And this is one thing when it applies to a standard widget, a standard product that you might sell. But it's another thing when it applies to software, because we know software is fundamentally complex. We know it's very, very easily distributed. And we know that its use cases, even for established software, many users use it differently and get different value out of it. But does it still follow the general trend that as you increase quantities, the number of people, the demand, the number of people or consumers willing to pay a certain price for it will essentially decrease. And the cost of supporting those consumers will increase over time. And in the case of something like a piece of software, one might say, well, it's very easy to distribute, it's almost zero cost to distribute, and therefore a free rider should be pretty well tolerated. But in a case where every single consumer that you support needs a different set of requirements or has a different way of using it, you have essentially a cost associated, in this case now with the community, that's going to ultimately pull value as something that you have to consider. Now, in this case, we're looking at something that appears to be a zero-sum game, but because the economy or economies, unlike things like the natural resources of the earth, are somewhat elastic. And basically, you can create a win-win scenario or a non-zero-sum game essentially by doing something like increasing the demand. And if you can increase the demand, you'll shift the curve, and not only do you increase the consumer surplus associated with it, but you also increase the producer surplus, granted at possibly a higher cost, but fundamentally you're growing the system and you're growing the value for all of the players. And this is essentially what I want you to remember as we go in and talk a little bit about Etrix. And ultimately, for Etrix, this concept of demand was really important to us as a driving force. And the idea of increasing demand in terms of focusing on the number of projects that we support with the application, that was fundamentally Transmart. So this was the Etrix framework that EK had gone over yesterday, and this comes directly out of our description of work and some of the early slides. And there's one thing that's missing here that probably is not something that you get from the slide from what EK had talked about. Well, one of the things that Etrix had originally wanted to do was have a really core content role in terms of pulling a set of desperate, complicated clinical studies together, having it in a single repository, and being able to avail that repository to essentially Europe, essentially any researcher who's interested in Europe. So we had the concept of we were going to have a multi-tenant environment. It was going to be in one data center, and that's essentially what we would, part of the value that we would provide. And the conversation last night, the panel conversation about the difficulties in trying to make that legally work, the difficulties in trying to convince people to share data, essentially was an impediment to that element of the Etrix vision. So ultimately, we don't have a multi-tenant environment. What we have essentially are supporting projects, and typically supporting projects piecemeal, where each project has its own instance. Other than that, everything that EK had talked about yesterday is essentially in play. And if you look at a number of the things, we have a lot of work within the software, whether they're direct enhancements and direct development to Transmart, but also what I call the decorations on top of Transmart, things like the EHS and the EA, the things that were talked about yesterday. And we also have value-added services around this, because ultimately we're focused on customers and supporting customers. And with that, you don't just need software, you have to have a service and be able to convert people who are interested in that into actually users. And again, the content side, which again didn't emerge in the way that we thought, but the others did. What I'm showing you here is essentially almost up until today, the path that Etrix had taken. And I won't go into any of the individual items in what was our roadmap and what is our deliveries. But I'll list a couple things on the top and bottom. One is that the platform, so we went through now 4 versions of the platform, which is fundamentally based in Etrix. We also needed to support projects. And one of the really, I think, interesting and really positive things about the way that Etrix was set up and the way the collaboration agreement was written and the description of work was written is that a key performance indicator, and the main key performance indicator for us, was supported projects. And we needed to support 40 of them. At our midterm review, which actually was a little later than midterm, we were running about 13. And there was pretty reasonable concern that we wouldn't meet that key performance indicator. And what our midterm reviewers told us, and I thought we were actually doing pretty well, and they said, well, 13 is pretty good, right? We didn't know what 40 actually meant. 13 is pretty good. And what they said at the end is, the main thing you have to focus on is attaining that goal of 40 projects. And that has to sort of reverberate through everything the collaboration does and essentially become part of that culture. And that's what essentially we tried to do. And what was interesting is, so Mike will be speaking next, is our the lead for our Strategic Advisory Board. The last time we met, which was entering the end game of the last 18 months, one of the things our advisors had kind of, and at that point we had like 27 projects. And one of the things that the advisory board said is maybe you shouldn't worry so much about attaining that magic number 40. Maybe what you should worry about is making sure the assets that you've generated are in a position to carry on once the collaboration is over, and make sure that you have a sustainability in place. And that is actually really, really good advice. But it also went counter to what we were trying to reinforce in terms of everyone working in Etrix. In the end, we're running at 58 as of early last week. And most of them are actually associated with the platform. And a key element of the platform that I'll talk about, that I think has come up, but I'll talk about it. I think it's important to reiterate. And a lot of them are associated with services. Some of them training, some of them associated with, again, some of the decorations that you saw yesterday, including most recently uptake of the Disease Maps program, which I'm actually really, really excited to see. And I'll leave it there, but just to say that we hit something, a key performance indicator that was really important to us. And the whole idea, coming back to that demand curve, is why this was so important is we needed to drive demand to drive sustainability. And ultimately our sustainability is going to be based on commercial enterprises. ITTM, that Reinhardt founded, spin-off from Luxembourg, ultimately a spin-off of best practices from Etrix. Biosite Consulting, trying to move forward the concept of the Etrix network, where public-private partnerships can be provided with the types of services and products that have been outcomes of Etrix. Again, very difficult things to do, very important things to do, but ultimately predicated on the demand that we generate now during the project. And so again, a really important element of what we've been trying to do. And I'll talk a little bit about the platform because I think everything, all of those projects, whether they're directly supported by the platform or not, are fundamentally predicated on the success of building an fully open source stack through Transmart. And that fully open source stack includes PostgreSQL. And that was a year's worth of EK's group, a year's worth of development effort from Etrix. And there were others involved. The foundation, of course, was involved. And the University of Michigan had some resources as well. But most of that conversion happened within EK's group. And it was critical to driving the adoption of now a fully open source stack through public-private partnerships and the academic consortiums that we supported. And that includes the best practices. Everything's predicated on that delivery. Now there's another way of looking at the price quantity curve. There's one thing of increasing demand, but another thing that we really tried to do, and I think this was probably most important to me when we started this off, was the idea that you can play with the cost curve. And maybe you can adjust the slope of the cost curve. You can adjust it down, increase your consumer surplus, as well as allow, and partly because you allow projects to reduce their cost and costs associated with infrastructure. If we had one piece of infrastructure that could be used across a number of translational products, which were essentially being custom coded for every new project, every large project, you ought to see an inherent benefit. And that was a big driver for what Etrix has done. One of the things to note and why this is potentially so challenging, again, we talk about bioinformatics tools. With Transmart, the use scenarios are very diverse. And every time you have a diverse use scenario, you have new requirements, and you have new costs, and you have new implementation. And one of the things that you struggle with an application like this is to somehow find a way of enabling these diverse use cases within the context of a single product. And Adriano's talk yesterday couldn't have come at a more perfect time because I didn't need to add another slide last night. What you saw there was, I think, exactly what the vision that Kay's has always had, right? This kind of core element, this core data element, exposed in a way that can be tailored to individual projects. And those beautiful sets of visualizations that he demonstrated on his neuroscience project is exactly the way that you can envision people using this. Tailored to the use cases, but fundamentally based on a costly, sophisticated data infrastructure. And that's what he's implemented. And that's the promise here. And so you can start off already in your project with something like Etrix, the Etrix platform, and find yourself in a situation where you can spend your resources tailoring your visualizations, your analyses, based on an already established data model, and essentially provide the most value to your project while still managing your costs in an effective way. I'm going to skip this slide. I'm going to get to the last one. So, the most important thing that we're dealing with in the last year, the project, and it hasn't been the last year, it really started off in year 2. And I have to applaud people like Scott and the others on the executive committee for forcing the sustainability component of Etrix. Ultimately, all these best practices are going to be combined into this concept of Etrix network. And ultimately, that's going to be provided as partners to new public-private partnerships that start up. Or hopefully those partnerships, either through a commercial engagement or through a partnering engagement, can make use of these best practices that can be applied in a way that just makes sense for these complicated engagements. And I'm going to leave you with a couple thoughts. So, in terms of what we're almost back on time, so I'm a little late. Whether it's right now or whether it's moving on into the final 8 or 9 hours of this conference. I talked a little bit yesterday about, well, what's the future look like? Is it machine learning, or is, for data reuse, are we going to have data science robots? That's the fun topic. One of the things I noted yesterday at the final panel session was we had conversations that honestly I think we've all heard before, but they're important conversations, and they're lively conversations, they're engaging conversations about how do you get people to share data. One of the really kind of neat things about that conversation is that someone, our colleague from Barcelona, had noted that we're missing some key stakeholders in that conversation. One of the physicians, one of the patients. And so we can have those types of conversations, maybe disagree a little and walk out, but the door is still not upset and communicating. In terms of what we've been hearing, it's fundamentally a change community with Transmart as Etrix is coming to its end, and trying to consider whether we do extend collaboration. When 17.1, which is now sitting as potentially a key enabler for now a refreshed Transmart I2B2 Foundation, and potentially serving as part of an important aspect to drive the sustainability package associated with Etrix. It emerged out of commercial entities getting together with very disparate requirements and trying to work together to come up with this 17.1 and essentially shouldering the burden that comes with collaboration. And what it essentially did is it drove for those individual companies, it drove the consumer circles down. and for some of them less than 0, and to the point where they may be forced to leave the community. But it's left essentially a really important product in a nascent state. And because 3 of those entities are part of Metrix, they're coming to the decision as whether Metrix is going to carry that forward or help or be a driving force in carrying that forward. And it is important to know, again, what happens with diverse requirements. And also that we're sitting with somewhat, by the way I look at it, the ashes of 17.1. And whether a phoenix can grow out of those ashes, and whether that phoenix will have wings. And that's essentially the biggest thing that I, the XCOM, and the rest of Metrix has to decide in about 24 hours, and whether you move that forward. And ultimately, the decision to move that forward, to carry that burden for another year with Metrix, is going to be predicated on the value that it can do for customers, not only in Europe, but for customers, anyone who's interested in the Metrix platform and using these types of systems. So it's fundamentally driven off continued focus on customers, the core value that's been carried forward through Metrix. I'll get back to what was supposed to be the title of my talk about infrastructure coordinating things. Even though I can't spell infrastructure, I can't spell coordinating. I think this is a trick question. This is a trick question, right? Infrastructure doesn't coordinate projects. Infrastructure enables projects. It enables, in projects of today, honestly, it doesn't mean today, I mean, it's the last 50 years, 20 years, at least as long as I've been in the business. Infrastructure enables, doesn't coordinate. And infrastructure drives down cost. Infrastructure facilitates science, and that's where we position ourselves. And that's what we try to do in this project. And I will just say as we come to the end of it, for all the folks who are sitting here in Metrix, it's been a pleasure to be a part of it. It's been a pleasure to be working with you. And I'm inspired by the way you took that mission and generated the value that you did for a lot of projects that are enjoying that value. Thank you very much. I think the next person up is Mike Barnes, representing RA.